Hello, and welcome to my first wrap up of the year. January was a slow reading month for me, but it was a varied one. So we've got an award winning Japanese classic, we've got a cozy fantasy, a romantasy, and a classic work of nonfiction. So let's jump right into it. My first read of the year was Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata. This was the 1968 winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And as you may know, in these wrap-ups, I try to distill the essence of each of my reads into 6 words or less. So my attempt to do that for Snow Country is this. A gripping landscape hosts empty people. The very short description in the back of my copy says the following. To the snow country, isolated from the rest of Japan through the long winter months, comes the cynical Shimamura, drawn there by the warmth of a young geisha, Komako. Their story is the foundation for one of the finest novels in modern Japanese literature. This is essentially a married man who is traveling to this winter vacation town to spend time with this geisha that he has spent time with previously. The rhythm of the dialogue here is really different than what I'm used to in an interesting way, but it felt oddly stilted to me. And I couldn't tell if that was an issue with the translation or if it was an intentional attempt on the part of the author to favor poeticism in the dialogue over realism, or if it was more of like a cultural translation issue where there are just certain aspects or like idiosyncrasies of Japanese culture that were reflected in the dialogue that were kind of not accessible to me. In any case, there's some really beautiful imagery throughout in which the landscape melds with the people and or their thoughts. I really appreciated the use of language and that imagery and the overall reflective tone throughout this novel. I thought that was really beautiful. But ultimately, this is about a married man with children back home who is off away from his family with a geisha who he's not especially kind to either. And he doesn't really show much character growth at all throughout the story. I think that was intentional, but perhaps I didn't pick this book up at a time when I was ready to deal with that kind of a character. I had a little bit of a rough start to the year this year, and I think I just like wasn't in the mood to read about a man whose sense of his own profundity came from him having a midlife crisis, essentially. I kind of just wanted to be like, you're not that deep. You're just like a walking cliche. He does acknowledge this eventually. Let me find the quote. He had stayed so long that one might wonder whether he had forgotten his wife and children. He stayed not because he could not leave Komako, nor because he did not want to. He had simply fallen into the habit of waiting for those frequent visits. And the more continuous the assault became, the more he began to wonder what was lacking in him. What kept him from living as completely? He stood gazing at his own coldness, so to speak. He could not understand how she had so lost herself. All of Komako came to him, but it seems that nothing went out from him to her. He heard in his chest, like snow piling up, the sound of Komako, an echo beating against empty walls, and he knew that he could not go on pampering himself forever. So that self-reflection is there. It finally appears in this moment, but this is page 126 of 142 pages. So for me, it felt like a little too late, like too little, too late for what I wanted to see throughout so much of this novel. But you can still hear in the prose there, again, even in translation, how beautifully this is written and how well the landscape is sort of incorporated into the people's actual thoughts and feelings. So for instance, the sense of him having like an internal coldness or like a lack of emotion, a lack of feeling, and then hearing in his chest like snow piling up the sound of Komako. I really love the way that that is worded there. Ultimately, what was the issue for me is that I never felt like I truly got to know any of these characters well, and therefore couldn't find myself invested in their thoughts or feelings or their neuroses or like what might become of them. And I do understand that it was most likely intentional that we would feel distant from these people. And I appreciate that, but I think just in the moment that I read it, it's not what I was looking to get out of a novel. I'm really character driven, and I feel like I can really enjoy a novel that has a lot of character development, even if the plot is really quiet and like nothing is happening. And if I don't feel invested in any of the characters, whether I love them or hate them or anything in between, then no amount of like really exciting plot development can save that book for me. So I feel like this is a good example of a work that would have been incredibly memorable for me if I had connected with any of the characters in it. That said, I am still really glad that I read this, and I definitely want to be reading some more Japanese literature, so I look forward to finding some more titles. Okay, shifting gears completely, we've got Bookshops and Bonedust by Travis Baldree. Orc reads smut, makes friends. That's my summary. This is a prequel to Legends and Lattes, which I read last year and really loved for its sweet, warm, cozy vibe. I knew exactly what to expect, and that's zero stakes and lovable characters. I expected it to feel like a warm hug, and that's kind of what I was looking for in that moment. So I was excited to pick it up. Honestly, though, I like vaguely remember the plot at this point. So we've got Viv, who's a mercenary orc. She's been injured and has to temporarily set up shop in this old, ailing bookshop. The hospitable bookshop owner starts recommending books for her, and she begins to really develop a taste for reading, especially the smutty stuff, and enjoying her conversations about the books with her new friend. She helps to save the bookshop. She befriends a small but mighty gnome. She has a short-lived, cute, like sapphic romance. She is determined to free an entrapped skeleton named Satchel. She fights a necromancer at some point. These are all things that happen, but even though it sounds like there's a lot happening, there's kind of nothing happening at the same time because we feel very confident the entire time that everyone's going to be fine, nothing bad is going to happen. And when I put it like that, it does sound like I remember quite a bit of the plot, but I never really got that invested in the story this time. And I don't think that it was because of the low stakes, because when I read Legends and Lattes, it was very similar. And I really did enjoy reading that. I remembered the story better, and I remembered the characters more and their interactions and all of that. So I think honestly what the issue was here is that this time around I read it as an audiobook. There's certain kinds of books that work well for me as an audiobook and certain ones that don't. And I haven't fully figured out like what the exact pattern is. But I think I've learned now that certainly if the book is too low stakes, if there isn't anything that's like super gripping happening in the plot, that it's much easier for my mind to wander while I'm listening to the audiobook. I did intend to read a physical copy because I have the physical copy of Legends and Lattes, and so I wanted to, own the prequel to it. But they didn't have it at a local bookshop when I went, and it was available as an audiobook, so I decided to just kind of start it on audio. So now I know I do still want to read the other installment of this series, but that one I will definitely pick up as a physical book and then see how that goes. And then with those three together, I can like properly judge if it was the book or just like the audio version of it. My next read was Wild Reverence, Gods and Mortals, Love and Chaos. So this one is a prequel as well, but a prequel to Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. I didn't realize initially that I was reading a prequel. I knew that it was the same author, but it took me a while to start to notice some of the connections, and then looked it up, and sure enough, it was a prequel, and I'm glad that I confirmed that because I was able to appreciate some of the little details a little bit more than I otherwise would have. This is technically classified, I guess, as a romantasy, and I usually struggle a little bit with romantasy and did enjoy this one quite a bit. I think that part of the reason for that is that the fantasy elements were tied to this whole mythology that the author has created, and anything that has to do with interactions and drama between gods and mortals usually is something that I am really into. I really appreciated the rich mythology that Ross develops here, obviously inspired by a lot of Greek mythology and other kinds of myth, but Ross also incorporates some of her own original concepts here, and the world building in general for this story was really cool. In this world, we've got two realms of gods. We've got the skyward and we've got the underlings, and then in between, you've got the mortal realm, but our main character, Matilda, was born of a skyward god and an underling god. So she becomes the messenger of the gods, able to transport messages from one realm to another, including the mortal realm as well, and as we later learn, the realm of death itself, the afterlife. Whenever a god is born, a new constellation forms in the sky, and the number of stars in that constellation determines the level of power that that god will wield, and also where they will fall within the hierarchy. You would think the more power the better, but actually gods can kill other gods in this world, which really raises the stakes. And also, when they kill a god, they can then steal that god's powers. And so, in fact, having more humble powers makes life much safer for a god in this universe. However, that does not prevent gods from still wanting to accumulate more power, because in mythology, as in real life, people attempt to obtain as much power as possible and wield it in terrible ways, as we know. When gods or mortals die, they enter the wasteland, and from there they try to enter the mist. And to do so, they need to bypass the crone, who weighs their soul. But she doesn't weigh their soul based on good deeds, but rather based on good stories. So if they have interesting enough stories to tell her, the kind of stories of their life that she relishes to hear, then they get kind of like points on the scale and eventually pass through. So that's a really interesting twist on the idea of like the ability to enter into eternal paradise. Is, did you have an interesting enough life? Because this crone, she thirsts for these stories that she can't really like live out herself. There's lots of other cool details like this, and the mythology was my favorite element of the story. Now, the love story that's at the heart of everything is between a goddess, Matilda, and a mortal named Vincent. They meet in his dreams because she's able to kind of travel into his dreams when they're young, which is an interesting concept in and of itself. And he doesn't know her name at the time. He calls her Red because of her red hair. There's enduring love. There's war in the mortal realm that, of course, the gods get involved with. There's politics and scheming, both by the gods and the mortals. There's life, death. It's a big story, and I liked the overall themes, and as I said earlier, the world building. The main issues with the story, however, for me were this. Number one, the pacing dragged a bit every so often. Maybe that's just me because I tend to like zone out during war scenes a lot, but that was the effect that the story had on me numerous times, and it is a fairly long one. And secondly, I found the main character to be kind of bland, actually. Matilda certainly goes through a lot, and the plot surrounding her circumstances and her fate and her powers is really compelling. But Matilda herself remains pretty uninteresting. There's a secondary love story here that kind of mirrors Matilda and Vincent's a little bit, and that's Bade, who's the god of war, but like kind of a sweetheart deep down. And he's also like the sworn protector of Matilda, and he falls for a mortal queen, Adria. Their backstory is really interesting. These two characters are interesting to me, and I kind of wish that we had gotten their story. Like if Rebecca Ross ever wrote a side, novella on those two, I would absolutely read that. Speaking of mythology, we're moving on to my last read of the month. This is Mythology, Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes by Edith Hamilton, a comprehensive guide to Greek mythology. Okay, I can't do book plus tea. Towards the end of 2025, I posted a video about my reading intentions for 2026, and one of my goals was to read more nonfiction. So this fits the bill, but also a goal was to kind of do a deep dive into Greek mythology because, as you know from the previous book I just talked about, I really love myth. So this kind of kills two birds with one stone for me here. And I have been meaning to read it for like at least a decade. It's been sitting on my bookshelf. I also, totally unrelated, but just wanted to share that isn't this like the most appropriate bookmark to use for this book? This is the Nike of Samothrace, which is an ancient Greek statue. It's displayed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and it's perfect use for it. So many of these stories are already pretty familiar to me, some of them very familiar and some of them like vaguely familiar. but to attempt to put them all together and to figure out like a timeline of the history and also just like the family trees of all of these gods and just the convoluted nature of it all, because Zeus had so many children with so many goddesses and mortal women. I think I had never really like sat down and tried to put it all together before. So this book does that for you. It's broken down into 5 very distinct sections with subcategories within those. So part 1 is the gods, the creation, and the earliest heroes. Part 2 is stories of love and adventure. Part 3 is the great heroes before the Trojan War. Then part 4 is the heroes of the Trojan War. So this is basically like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then part 5 is the great families of mythology, detailing 3 separate mortal families. And then part 6 is the less important myths. And lastly, part 7 is the mythology of the Norsemen. So it kind of provides an introduction to Norse mythology as well at the end. So I'll be fully honest here. I fully read most of these sections, but there were a couple that I kind of just skimmed. So for instance, the heroes of the Trojan War, I have read in full the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I'm planning a reread of the Odyssey this year. So obviously those are going to give me more detailed account of the heroes of the Trojan War than a summary of those, right? So I kind of skimmed through that section. And then the last section on the mythology of the Norsemen, I also just skimmed through that because in my mind, I was reading this for the sake of getting all of the Greek mythology. I'm really interested in other kinds of mythology as well and want to do deep dives into those in the future. But this is not the year for that. So I kind of left Norse mythology for another time. But I still consider this as having like fully read the book, at least for my purposes, what my goal was with it. What really clicked into place for me while reading this was the fact that in most cases, we don't really have one definitive version of any given myth. We really come to an overall understanding of a particular myth from piecing together the way that different authors have presented and interpreted those stories over time, sometimes hundreds of years apart. She draws from the Roman versions of these myths as well. Now, what's nice is that Hamilton throughout is really careful about noting which sources she is taking her details from, and specifically which parts came from whom. Now, this resulted in so much often judgy commentary on these ancient authors, and I became highly invested in this whole side quest. Please join me for some excerpts here. This story is alluded to in the Odyssey and the Aeneid, but only Apollodorus tells it in full. He wrote probably in the 1st or 2nd century AD, a dull writer, but less dull than usual in this tale. 2 pages later, both Ovid and Apollodorus tell this story. Apollodorus lived probably more than 100 years after Ovid. He is a very pedestrian writer, and Ovid is far from that. But in this case, I have followed Apollodorus. Ovid's account shows him at his worst, sentimental and exclamatory. Another 2 pages later, the entire story is told by both Ovid and Apollodorus. The latter, probably 100 years later than Ovid, every single time she lets you know how many years before or after, is here the superior of the 2. His account is simple and straightforward. Ovid's extremely verbose. For instance, he takes 100 lines to kill the sea serpent. I have followed Apollodorus. Okay, now we're jumping like 30 pages. I have followed in my account Apollodorus, who probably wrote in the 1st or 2nd century AD. Ovid's tale is good only occasionally. He gives a charming picture of Atalanta among the hunters, which I have put into my account. But often, as in the description of the boar, he is so exaggerated he verges on the ridiculous. Apollodorus is not picturesque, but he is never absurd. At this point, I feel like she's bashed both Apollodorus and Ovid to some degree, and I just kind of want to read both of them myself and make my own determination about who is the better author. Last one in this drama, Apollodorus, who probably wrote in the 1st or 2nd century AD. He is usually very uninteresting, but in treating the events leading up to the Iliad, he was apparently inspired by touching so great a subject, and he is less dull than in almost any other part of his book. So every time she compliments him, she also manages to call him really boring. So anyway, I love the mythology, but I also just kind of loved the petty takedowns of these ancient authors. Overall, this is really great as a reference. It does read a whole lot like a history textbook, minus those little asides about the authors. And if you're okay with that, then this works really well. I can see how that definitely serves the purpose, but I did keep wishing that it had a little bit more of a narrative voice throughout, because we're talking about stories essentially here. I mean, it's obviously mixed in with Greek history itself, but a lot of it is fictional stories. So I wish the book sounded a little bit more like storytelling, but obviously that wasn't the intended goal here. It's still really great because it makes Greek mythology very accessible, I think. Okay, on to my February TBR. I forgot to grab those titles. I'm gonna need to come back. Okay, I'm back. So I'm not much of a romance reader, but this being February and gearing up for Valentine's Day, I decided that this was gonna be the day that I was gonna give romance reads more of a chance. So I made a little list of myself of some of the most popular romance authors. I've never read any of them, and my intention is to select one title from each. I've almost completed one of them already, and I'm probably not going to be able to get to all of these. I mean, I can actually guarantee that I won't get to all of these, but I'm going to try to do as many as I can in time to film a video around Valentine's Day about my impression of these romance reads. So the authors that I've listed here are Abby Jimenez, Ali Hazelwood, Emily Henry. That's the one that I've almost completed. And then I've also got potentially Julia Quinn, Casey McKiston. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. Tanya Ann Crosby, or actually, that's not one of the popular ones. I think that's one that I just happened to have on my Kindle because there was some free romance book a few years ago that was available that somebody sent me a link for, and I just decided to download it, and I had never read it. So that one I have started already as well, but that's not one of like the highly popular ones. And then I've also got this one here. Oh, this is the Casey McKiston? Sorry, Casey. McKiston or McQuiston, I'm not sure. In any case, this one I was familiar with. I'd seen some other booktuber talk about it, I believe. Red, White, and Blue. And this I found in a free little library. So I just went ahead and grabbed it, left a book. I didn't steal this, I exchanged it. And that's one of the ones that I definitely want to be able to fit in because it was a fun little find. So those are the primary romance books that I'm going to try to get to. Again, I'll just do as many as I can in the first half of the month. But other than that, I'm also planning on a reread of this guy, of Wuthering Heights. The film for this is coming out about the middle of the month, I think around Valentine's Day as well. I don't anticipate loving that film, although who knows, it could surprise me. But this is one of my all-time favorite novels, and another one of my goals this year is to actually do some rereads of some of my all-time favorites, because I am not by any means a rereader, but I'm going to give it a shot this year. So I'm looking forward to delving back into this one. Other than that, I may add another title or two, but it sounds to me like this is probably about as much as I can do unless I get through these more quickly than expected. Then I would probably add something that's certainly outside the realm of romance to add a little variety to my TBR. But those are my plans. Thank you guys so much for joining me here as always. Tell me in the comments, was January a slow or fast reading month for you? And did anything really stand out? I'm always looking for new recommendations. Happy reading and see you in the next one.